You know, modern games are cool and all, but sometimes it's nice to go back and take a look at something a bit more retro. Yeah, I know a lot of you consider this to be old school, but I'm actually thinking of something even older. Now we're talking. Now this would normally be my stop, but today we're going back a bit further. Here we go. Ah, the days when gameplay was king, because that's literally all video games had to offer. These old games had virtually nothing in the way of presentation. There was no story, no real characters, hardly any music. Hell, there was barely even any graphics. It was a time when all you were given was a simplistic set of gameplay mechanics, the only purpose of which was to accumulate points. Was it a better time? No. Playing a lot of these old games is kind of like, how do I say this?
Oh, licking envelopes can be fun. All you have to do is make a game of it.
What kind of game?
Well, you can see how many you can lick in an hour, and then try to break that record.
Yeah, it's like that. Now, although I consider the NES to be my first real system, I'm actually old enough that I have several years of memories playing the Atari 2600. And while time has not been kind to this system in general, I still think some of these games hold up better now than others. So with that in mind, I'd like to take a look back at 7 of my favorite Atari 2600 games. So let's start with the obvious one, Pitfall. Now I know it may not look like much now, but it can't be overstated how huge this game was back in the day. This was basically the equivalent in popularity to Super Mario Bros. 3 on the NES. It was a very big deal. Keep in mind that at the time, the most popular games were mostly single-screen experiences like Pac-Man and Asteroids and Missile Command. But Pitfall presents you with dozens, hundreds of unique screens, which can be explored from either direction. Also unique for the time, Pitfall actually has an ending. You have to collect all the treasures in the jungle within 20 minutes to beat the game. Of course, the game doesn't actually tell you this, you need to read the manual to find that out. And let me tell you, as a 5 or 6-year-old with limited reading skills, this particular detail was completely lost on me. Fortunately, Pitfall was fun and unique enough at the time that my friends and I were able to enjoy it for hours at a time, without ever realizing that there was more to the game beyond just running and jumping and swinging from vines. Now here's another one that would probably be on most people's lists, River Raid. Now, I know this is not too impressive by today's standards, but remember that in 1982, scrolling shooters like this still weren't that common. The most popular titles in the genre were still games like Space Invaders, with all the action taking place on a single static screen. So just take my word for it that, by comparison, River Raid looked like this. To me at least. River Raid is essentially an infinitely scrolling obstacle course with seemingly endless variety in its stage layout and enemy placement. The river is sectioned off by these bridges, which also act as checkpoints, so when you die, you restart at the last bridge you destroyed. Now, as far as I know, there's no ending to the game. If you have the skills to avoid crashing or running out of fuel, you could probably play this game forever. Of course, that's easier said than done. I can get to 27,000 points.
Can you?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I mean, yeah.
Resident Evil, Fatal Frame, Silent Hill. Those games are all scarier than this one. The haunted house was genuinely, not really frightening. Creepy isn't the right word either. Actually, it was never very scary at all. But check out this amazing box art. Believe it or not, this is actually a pretty good representation of what the actual gameplay is like. Sort of. As near as I could tell, this is one of the earliest ancestors of the survival horror genre. You explore the various floors of this haunted house, using the light from your infinite supply of matches to check the various nooks and crannies for the scattered pieces of this trophy thing. Oh, that's an urn? My mistake. Occasionally you'll encounter wandering enemies like a spider or a bat or a friggin' ghost, and this is where the game actually gets a little nerve-wracking. They will extinguish your match light as soon as they appear, and if you're careful, you can stay out of sight and they'll just slowly creep along their way. But they will immediately give chase if they see you, and if they catch you, you go crazy. To death. I'll be honest, as primitive as this game is, the atmosphere is surprisingly effective. It seems like Defender usually gets the credit for creating the shooter genre, but in my opinion, Vanguard is a far more convincing rough draft for the flagship series the genre is known for. Now, I don't know that Vanguard actually was an influence for games like R-Type and Gradius, but take a look at how progressive this game was. And remember, this was originally in arcades in 1981. Gradius wouldn't come out until 1985. For starters, any shooter can scroll in one direction, but Vanguard scrolls in all the directions. Vertically, horizontally, up, down, right, but not to the left. What's the matter with you? That is going backwards, and Vanguard only goes forward, to the future, with innovations like a progress screen before each stage, like Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins would do years later. And speaking of stages, most of these have unique hazards and enemies. You could also shoot in 4 directions, there are power-ups to collect, and even a boss battle at the end. Got him. Wait, did I? And just check out this box art. Man, I want to play this game. I mean, this game's fine, but this game looks amazing. Now, these next 2 games I never actually owned as a kid, and in fact, I only had an opportunity to play them twice a year. My dentist had an Atari 2600 in his waiting room with exactly 2 games. The first one is, obviously, Plaque Attack, because honestly, why wouldn't he have this game? You play as a tube of toothpaste defending a mouthful of teeth from incoming waves of junk food like hamburgers, french fries, ice cream cones, and strawberries. Wait, what? It's a pretty fast-paced game, particularly by the 5th wave or so when the food starts moving less predictably. And if any of this processed food comes in contact with your teeth, well, you brought this upon yourself. But just like in real life, if you are fast enough with the toothpaste, you can stop this tooth decay before it's too late. And you grow a new tooth every 2,000 points. Pro tip, with only about 35 seconds to complete each wave, you don't always have the time to be too selective with your shots. So don't bother with individual button presses, just hold down the fire button for a continuous barrage of minty fresh, smile brightening, fluoride death bullets. If the clock runs out before the screen is clear, you will be powerless to stop the remaining food items from melting your teeth. Now, Plaque Attack is a fun game, but it's admittedly the least remarkable title on this list. However, the other game my dentist had is quite possibly my favorite game in the entire 2600 library, Keystone Capers. You play as an old-fashioned police officer chasing an escaped convict through a shopping mall. Yeah, I know he's probably supposed to be a burglar, but he's wearing one of those old-fashioned black and white prison jumpsuit things. So I can only assume that he's broken out of prison and went straight to the mall for some new clothes from Banana Republic. You have to avoid hazards like runaway shopping carts and renegade toys, and at the bottom of the screen there's a mini-map that shows both your location and the burglars. Now you can ascend to each of the upper levels using the escalators on each side of the map, or if you're patient, you can use the elevators here in the middle. The control is fantastic for such an old game, and the gameplay is quick and satisfying. Now I'd love to see this game get updated and re-released, maybe as a cheap downloadable title. With a few tweaks like maybe additional stages or even just a multiplayer mode, I think this could still appeal to modern audiences. When I woke up one Christmas morning to find Pitfall under the Christmas tree, it was far and away the best present I got that year. But this was at the very end of my time with the 2600. By the following Christmas, Nintendo had pretty much taken over the video game world. And once I experienced Super Mario Bros., I never looked back. But leading up to that fateful Christmas morning when I finally got Pitfall, there were several years of just wanting it. Every time my parents brought me to the mall and allowed me to spend what little money I had on a new video game, Pitfall would always be sold out. There was one time in particular when KB Toys had once again let me down, and determined not to go home empty-handed, I instead picked out a game that looked very similar to Pitfall, judging by the box art at least. Yeah, it wasn't the real thing, but I thought maybe there was a chance I would get lucky and it would play exactly like it. That game was Jungle Hunt, and it played nothing like Pitfall. For one thing, Jungle Hunt is structured more like Donkey Kong, in that a full circuit through the game is composed of multiple unique scenarios, which combine together to form a complete narrative. Just as in Donkey Kong you run and jump through various areas of a construction site to ultimately rescue Pauline, in Jungle Hunt, you swing, swim, and jump through various areas of the jungle to ultimately teach those godless savages about our Christian God. Nah, I'm kidding, you gotta rescue some chick. How original. What's remarkable about Jungle Hunt, though, is that the play mechanics change wildly between each of its scenarios. Now, this kind of variety is relatively commonplace now, but back then it certainly wasn't. In fact, the only other comparable games from that era I can even think of would be Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr., and even those games changed only the structure of the stages. The gameplay itself remains consistent throughout the entire game. So I suppose in this regard, Jungle Hunt may have more in common with Battletoads than the Donkey Kong series. Now, despite my initial disappointment that I hadn't found the full analog to Pitfall that I was hoping for, I ended up enjoying Jungle Hunt quite a bit more. So much so that when I eventually got Pitfall later on, I honestly found it a bit underwhelming. That was the first time I remember finding that the satisfaction of owning something is not always better than the anticipation of wanting it. As for Jungle Hunt, it's still one of the games I think of most fondly when I look back on the Atari 2600, which is impressive considering the fact that I only bought the game because the box art vaguely reminded me of a different game entirely. So here's the part where I'm supposed to tell you that these games are just as fun as they've ever been, and you should throw out your Xbox or your Switch and bask in the glory of the Atari 2600. But I'm not going to say that. Yes, there's still fun to be had with these games, but there's no denying that they are incredibly primitive. Perhaps too primitive by today's standards, when even a game on your cell phone can offer a staggering amount of engaging content to which these repetitive and simplistic games just can't compare. And that's to say nothing of the issues with the hardware itself. These primordial consoles can be tricky to connect to modern TVs. And the controllers? They suck. And while you can get around these issues without too much trouble, you can get thrown one more curveball when you get an image so crusty and noisy that the games are practically unplayable. Now, it's likely that you have grown up with video games, but video games have grown up with you as well. The experiences games offer now and the expectations we have as gamers are quite a bit different from what they were 40 years ago. Be that as it may, if you choose to sit this entire generation out in favor of systems that can offer a more complete and satisfying gaming experience, there is nothing wrong with that, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But for those who are willing to rein in their expectations a bit and put up with a few quirks, the Atari 2600 is still an entertaining diversion from the more time-intensive games of modern consoles. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some retro games to play.